Welcome to ILTV Security Brief. I'm Khaled Ben David. Each week, we focus on the latest developments in security and defense relating to Israel and the Middle East, impacting on this region and beyond. And we start with our top items of the past week. All 20 living hostages are freed as part of the U.S.-mediated ceasefire agreement that saw Israel end its offensive against Hamas, partially withdraw from Gaza, and free 1,950 Palestinian security prisoners. Hamas has still not returned all the remains of the 28 hostages no longer alive, prompting warnings from the U.S. and Israel that the terror group is breaking the terms of the deal. President Trump, speaking at the Knesset podium, tells Israel, "You won the war, it's time for peace." And he then meets with Arab, Muslim, and European leaders in Sharm el-Sheikh, signing the Gaza ceasefire agreement with the leaders of Turkey, Qatar, and Egypt, and planning the reconstruction and governance plan for Gaza. Hamas reportedly executes over 30 people it accuses of collaborating with Israel as the terror group tries to reassert control over Gaza as the IDF begins its withdrawal. The IDF opens fire on Palestinians it says violated the ceasefire by approaching its troops despite repeated warnings to halt. Gaza sources saying 7 were killed in that incident. An Israeli airstrike eliminates a Hezbollah operative the IDF says was involved in attempting to rebuild the terror movement's military infrastructure in South Lebanon. This in violation of the ceasefire agreement signed with the Beirut government last November. And now our big story. The war is over, President Trump told Israelis from the Knesset, and you won. And indeed, the return of all living Israeli hostages from Gaza, the destruction of Hamas's military capability, and a commitment, on paper at least, that it will disarm, means Israel achieved its key goals of the conflict. But Hamas still exists in Gaza, and already its behavior, killing Palestinians accused of being collaborators, trying to rebrand its fighters as a Gaza police force, and failing to return all the dead hostages promptly, is raising serious concerns over Hamas's intentions moving forward. And beyond that are the arrangements the U.S. is making with Arab and Muslim countries for a post-war Gaza going to be sufficient to prevent a resurgence of Hamas and other terror groups there going forward? And will it prevent another Gaza war from happening? Well, here's President Trump and Prime Minister Netanyahu on the situation in Gaza.
But if they don't disarm, we will disarm them. They know I'm not playing games, okay? Now, we did something monumental. We got the hostages back. That was the first thing we had to do. Above all else, get the hostages back. Now, they misrepresented because we were told they had 26, 24 of dead hostages, if we can use those terms. And it seems as though they don't have that.
Mr. Trump says the war is over, but clearly the war is not over. The IDF is deployed to sections of Gaza still, and Hamas is still on the streets of Gaza. How can you say the war is over?
Well, we agreed to give peace a chance. We agreed that we should, the conditions in his 20-point plan are very clear. It's not only that we get the hostages out without getting our military out, but that we would subsequently have both demilitarization and disarmament. They're not the same thing. First, Hamas has to give up its arms. And second, you want to make sure that there are no weapons factories inside Gaza. There's no smuggling of weapons into Gaza. That's demilitarization. We agreed that that's part of the plan. And we also agreed, okay, let's get the first part done. And now let's give a chance to do the second part peacefully, which is my hope. But if not, I think I heard the president speak tonight. He said, listen, they better do it, or, how can I speak for him? He said, all hell breaks loose, okay? Well, I hope it doesn't.
And joining us now in studio is Reserves IDF Lieutenant Colonel Maurice Hirsch. He is the former head of military prosecution for Judea and Samaria, and he is now director of the Initiative for Palestinian Authority Accountability and Reform at the Jerusalem Center for Security and Foreign Affairs. Maurice, thank you so much for joining us. First of all, let's just talk about the situation with the remaining hostages, the bodies and remains of those hostages that not returned. It seems like, if we could say it, Hamas is up to its old tricks. But what What are they trying to achieve here in doing this?
Hamas has understood all the way since the beginning, Kalev, that the hostages are their insurance policy. Going forward, it's their leverage against Israel's civilian population, against the political echelon. That's how they work. They're a genocidal terrorist organization, and that's their leverage. So they're willing to play all of these games all the way along. We do have the bodies, we don't have the bodies. Even if we just remember with the bodies of the Bibas family.
Right.
Why would you even think of playing such a disgusting game with bodies of children, of women? And yet they did, and they do. Even last night, they returned another 4 bodies, 3 bodies, Israelis, 4th body, and just a random Gazan.
Right.
And it's not because they don't have the control. That is not true. They do have the control. They know where the bodies are, and they could do something else. But they're intentionally not doing it to drag out their insurance policy.
So the question, of course, is how Israel and how the guarantors of the agreement should be reacting. There had been reports earlier of Israel perhaps withholding some of the aid supposed to flow into Gaza, of keeping the Rafah crossing. Reportedly, there was pressure on Israel to give it the process more time. How should Israel and these international bodies be reacting?
So I believe, Kalev, that the way to ensure that we don't find ourselves back in the same situation again is strict adherence to what was at least agreed. The agreement was to return all of the hostages alive and dead immediately. Hamas is, for whatever reason, playing games. That needs to make really an impression on President Trump, all of the other guarantors of the agreement, and Israel. If we start on day one saying we're going to turn just a small blind eye to these breaches of the deal, tomorrow it will be a bigger breach and a bigger breach. And then we find ourselves in a situation where, well, why are you suddenly now standing up and saying, well, they've breached the agreement, so we need to go back to war? If we don't make sure that we deal with the small things, then they will just escalate all the time.
All right, well, let's even suppose now we get past this stage, the first stage of the deal, and move on to the second stage. In fact, there are some reports of discussions already starting on what it's called the second stage of the agreement, though Israeli officials are saying, no, we won't get into that until the first stage is complete. Obviously, the major need right now is to get some kind of alternative security force into Gaza to replace as Hamas filling this vacuum, as we already seeing it's doing. It's been very vague who's going to be involved here, which countries will take part. I want to get an idea of how you think that is going to play out and how you think Israel should be trying to influence who's going to be part or how that force is going to operate.
So I would like to suggest, Kalev, that the process should be somewhat different. It should first be a focus on disarming Hamas. As long as Hamas still holds a 5,000 to 7,000 strong military force, weapons, and the capabilities and the desire to be as brutal as we've seen them to be. We saw it in 2007 when they were throwing the PLO people off the tops of the buildings in the Gaza Strip, in the war when they took over. And we've seen it again now with the immediate executions on the streets. You can't talk about an alternative force until Hamas is disarmed. That is something which has to be first, and then you can discuss who is going to take their place. That has to be also agreed. But that is, I think, the first step.
Right. That may be the first step. But then who carries that out? Who checks that it's happening? These are big questions. Certainly we don't expect Hamas to really simply disarm itself. And it may, again, even offer resistance if another force tries to do so.
So I think that's really the nature of the agreement that was signed. It was more, let's agree to a general framework and then try and hammer out the small details, which really, it's like Swiss cheese. It had more holes than it did have cheese. And now we have to move forward and say, well, exactly what role are the Qataris going to play? Are they going to be the ones telling Hamas, you know what? You agreed to disarm. We, the Qataris, are going to enforce that by preventing your operations in Qatar, preventing the operations of your leadership, ensuring that you make good on your deal. Let's not forget that I think the strike in Doha, as much as it didn't succeed in taking out the Hamas leadership, it sent a message to the Qataris that also their double game is up. And so now I think the Qataris have an interest in making sure that their proxies, that Hamas, are moving forward, are going to meet that agreement, are going to give President Trump, first and foremost, what he has committed to. And that is something which I think we'll see. The opposite force, unfortunately, is a problem. And that's the Turkish force. Yeah. Erdogan is not coming to ensure that Hamas disarms. Erdogan is coming to ensure that Israel, the great aggressor, is not continuing to fight against Hamas. So you have really those two conflicting forces going now into the Gaza Strip, and really it could be a recipe for a disaster. We have to see how that really is going to be navigated between those different forces without even Israel being party to that.
Well, you're saying Israel not being part of it. What kind of security guarantees is Israel going to need if indeed, for example, you discuss the presence of Turkish forces in the Gaza Strip? Should Israel even accept something like that when we know at the same time it's making demands on Syria in those talks to try to avoid having Turkish forces right on its border?
So that's exactly it. Trying to navigate for Prime Minister Netanyahu to agree with President Trump who exactly is going to be that force that is going to go in, ensure on the one hand that Hamas disarms and all of that demilitarization that he described, making sure that they don't have weapons factories, that they don't have any type of weapons stocks which they can then pull out and use against us. That's a force which cannot be Turkish and cannot be solely Qatari and cannot be solely United Arab Emirates and cannot solely be American. So putting that force together, I think, is going to be one of the more complicated steps of stage 2/3, depending on which order you put them in. And that is something which I fear is going to be one of the major stumbling blocks going forward now, even before we haven't finished yet stage 1, right, which is persuading Hamas, you agree to release all the hostages, actually meet your agreements before anything else can go forward.
Right. But of course, even before that happens, the talks, you can be sure informally that's already being discussed among these nations and parties involved, and perhaps even started at Sharm el-Sheikh. Let's move beyond just even the security control. Then there is issue of the governance of the Gaza Strip. Of course, for Hamas, even if it wouldn't give up its arms, it would try to impact and influence on the civil governance. That was a source of its influence there. There's supposedly already reports Palestinians, technocrats being chosen for this. For Israel, a worrying sign, perhaps, that Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas was invited to Sharm el-Sheikh and seems to have been brought into the process already at this stage?
I don't think that there's necessarily any fear from Mahmoud Abbas and the Palestinian Authority. They barely control Judea and Samaria. They barely control Ramallah, let alone Jenin and Shechem. And moving on to Gaza, their declarations aside, is, I think, something which is completely unrealistic. And so it's finding that also that governance body, possibly under the auspices of this new Board of Peace, the guidance of ex-UK Prime Minister Tony Blair, potentially setting up this new body that will worry about prosperity for Gaza, developing Gaza, rather than terror and destroying Israel. That's what Hamas did. We now have to try and move forward if we seek a better lifestyle, not only for Israel, but also for the Gazans, for however many there are, whether it's 1 million, 1.5 million, 2 million, over 2 million. If we seek prosperity for them and not another war, then we have to find a way to move that forward. And I think bringing in really an independent group of technocrats run by someone who isn't connected to either of these groups and has a genuine commitment to moving forward is actually the right way to progress. This is something that we at the JCFA wrote already in November 2023. Talking about an alternative for Gaza underneath the guidance of an international guiding board, governance board, that will ensure that we don't go back to where we were on the 6th of October.
Right. And yes, I would say the presence of Mahmoud Abbas in Sharm was more of a symbolic gesture. But it does say in the agreement that at some point a reformed Palestinian Authority would have a role in governance. And of course, this is an area where you've been working on for many years. The agreement itself doesn't say What's a reformed Palestinian Authority? Who decides whether it's reformed? So let me ask you, as someone who's been involved in this for many years.
So I would have my idea of what exactly reforming the Palestinian Authority is, but let's take the American idea. Let's assume that we're building on the Peace for Prosperity, President Trump's peace plan, the deal of the century back in 2020. There was a list of different aspects of governance, civil governance, education, health, welfare, judiciary that needs to be changed within the Palestinian Authority. It was a long list. There were plans for every one of them. And then, if you remember, there was the peace conference in Manama, right? The Palestinian Authority, that President Trump's idea was to get buy-in of the Arab countries, a $50 billion peace plan for the Palestinian Authority, for the Palestinians, and they refused to go. Why did they refuse to go? Because they understood from the peace plan that the peace plan cuts them out of any financial governance. First and foremost, financial reform. Money isn't going to terrorism.
Right.
Money isn't going for the pay-for-slay. Billions of dollars being wasted on supporting and rewarding terrorists for murdering Jews. These things have to fundamentally change. And then you ask yourself, which of these Palestinian leaders is actually going to do that? Mahmoud Abbas is the father. That's his legacy for the Palestinian Authority. Pay-for-slay. He hasn't done anything else. He brought pay-for-slay. He developed pay-for-slay. He raised the salaries time after time after time. That's his legacy. And to say now, well, some other leader is going to come in and say, you know what, we're not going to pay salaries anymore. What about the subject of the refugees, right? The return of the refugees. Who now is going to tell the Palestinian people, the refugees will never go back to Israel. They will never flood and destroy Israel. You're going to have to live within the confines of this so-called Palestinian state. Who of them is going to be that brave to tell these people, you're always going to return to Israel? That's what they've said. Who's now going to stand up and say, for 75 years we've been lying to you, it's just not going to happen? Right. And these are the critical reforms that need to happen. Taking incitement out of the education process.
Right.
Is that something that's going to happen? Who's going to do that?
It's certainly not going to happen in a period of weeks or months, and potentially may take years and decades. I do want to know, President Trump, of course, saw this Gaza plan not just as bringing peace and prosperity to Gaza, but as part of a vision for a new Middle East, the term we've heard in Israel before, of Israel expanding its relations beyond those existing Arab states. He certainly, as President Trump, you would expect him to be very optimistic. I want to get your sense, though, the reality of how much of this process underway, if it proceeds in Gaza, is actually going to lead to expanding those ties, and with whom.
So I think if the countries that are involved really do give precedence to their national interest rather than allowing Mahmoud Abbas or Hamas or any other Palestinian leader to hold them back and to hold them hostage for their rejectionism, then we'll be able to see developments there. Whether MBS is going to allow Saudi Arabia to take advantage of a potential trade corridor that goes through Israel straight to the Middle East, instead of all the shipping around and through the Gulf, where Iran has more of an influence, where the Houthis have more of an influence. This is something which really is in the best interests of Saudi Arabia. It's in Israel's interests as well. But the question is, will they allow themselves to say, we are going to commit national, not necessarily suicide, but we're going to cut our nose to spite our face and allow Palestinian rejectionism and terrorism to hold us back? They've seen what happened with Morocco. They've seen what happened with Bahrain. They've seen what happened with the UAE. Social development, cultural development, financial development. And they are not oblivious to that.
And those ties remained during this conflict.
They remained even strong during the conflict. And so they're looking left and right and thinking, well, who do we want our bed partners to be? Hamas, Mahmoud Abbas, whichever person is going to take over from him. He's 89, almost 90 years old. I think on November 15th, he's going to turn 90 years old. He won't be around for a long time. Right. The next guy, this Hussein al-Sheikh, another terrorist in a suit. Are they going to allow that to be dictate their national interest, or are they going to look out for themselves?
All right. Well, these are certainly interesting, historic, momentous times, and we should just say a word. that with all that's happening, we're speculating getting those living hostages back, of course, has been the key benefit of this agreement so far, and at least Israel has that.
I have to admit, Kalev, that I did not believe that we would see the day when we got all of the live hostages back. I believe that Hamas would hold on to them for really forever. And so possibly there are stronger forces than we can even imagine operating in this environment and as part of this agreement. And when President Trump says you will disarm, Hamas will disarm.
Well, let's hope those forces keep working. Maurice Hirsch, thank you for joining us on ILTV.
Thank you very much.
And now a final word. This past week, the IDF ceased its offensive in Gaza, and after 738 days in captivity, all 20 of the living hostages were set free. And while some issues still remain unresolved, especially the return of the remains of all those hostages no longer living, this did mark the end of the Gaza War, the longest period of continuous military conflict in Israel's history. Certainly, President Trump made it clear in his Knesset address that from his viewpoint, the battle that began with the October 7th attack was now over, and Israel has emerged as the winner. And indeed, the two central aims laid out by the Israeli government as the paramount goals of the war, the return of the hostages and the elimination of Hamas as a military threat, have been largely achieved. But the result, at this stage at least, still feels well short of the total victory Prime Minister Netanyahu insisted was needed to bring the fighting to a close. Hamas still rules the streets of Gaza in those areas where the IDF has withdrawn, and its signed commitment to give up its weapons is belied by both its actions and the rhetoric of its leaders. The plans for a post-Hamas governance of Gaza still feel undefined, and the coalition of Arab and Muslim states that is supposed to oversee that process includes problematic players like Qatar and Turkey, whose past actions run counter to the stated aim of de-radicalizing a future Gaza. And while the Trump administration proved again and again its staunch support for Israel, its vision of a new Middle East living in peace with the Jewish state remains at this point more aspirational than actual. As always, Israel will have to rely primarily on itself and its defense forces to provide its own security in Gaza and elsewhere. But one thing the Gaza War proved decisively was that success on the battlefield itself is not enough for a relatively small nation in a primarily hostile region and an increasingly hostile world in order to achieve the type of victory that brings lasting peace. That means going forward that this and future Israeli governments must not replicate those mistakes that hindered the Gaza War effort the past 2 years. It must make greater diplomatic efforts to shore up existing alliances and create new ones where possible so that it can maintain international support in the war on terror, besides the expected backing from a stalwart U.S. There must also be a more sophisticated approach taking in making Israel's case to the world through the international media and newer fields of communication. This to counter both the unnatural biases against the Jewish state and the well-funded campaigns mounted against it by antagonistic regimes. And the leaders of Israel must make a priority of communicating its aims, intentions, and sympathies to their own people in a time of war, to prioritize national unity and put aside the promotion of other divisive issues when the people of Israel are being asked to make the ultimate sacrifice of themselves, their sons and daughters, in fulfilling their military duty at a time of conflict. In his sometimes rambling speech to the Knesset, President Trump returned again and again to one key point. Israel has won the war in Gaza, but now it must win the peace. He stressed that winning the peace can only come through a position of strength, and that means both maintaining a military preparedness at the highest level of efficiency and demonstrating a willingness to use that power when a country's security is threatened and other more peaceful means of deterring threats have been exhausted. But Trump also called on Israel's leaders to show openness and flexibility to new possibilities that may arise in the wake of the Gaza war, telling them that only by embracing the opportunities of the moment can we achieve our goals of ensuring that the horrors of recent years will never happen again. Now, only the naive could believe right now that the fight against Hamas was the last of Israel's wars, or perhaps even its final battle in Gaza itself. But at least the choices that Israel makes in the crucial days ahead might set it on the correct path to an eventual, true and lasting peace, rather than down the road to continue a conflict. Thank you for joining us on ILTV Security Brief.